Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us today for this talk with Professor Jochen Hellbeck on his new book, World Enemy Number One. And we're joined today by Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger, who will be leading today's conversation. For those that don't know YIVO, we're a very special place for the celebration and the contemplation and the contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers around the world. And we make those collections available through digitization initiatives, through reference and outreach, as well as through public programs like this and through classes and exhibitions. So if you're new to YIVO, we encourage you to check our resources out and to join us again. We're very pleased to have Professor Jochen Hellbeck sharing his new book today. Professor Jochen Hellbeck is Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, specializing in modern Russia, the Soviet Union, and the history of World War II. The recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin, among others, he's the acclaimed author of Stalingrad, the City That Defeated the Third Reich, Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin, and the online project Facing Stalingrad. Today's book, World Enemy Number One, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, and the Fate of the Jews, is a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. We're very pleased to be discussing that today. Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and the inaugural director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan. His most recent book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, The Pogroms of 1918 to 1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust, won the Stan Vine Book Award and a Canadian Jewish Literary Award. He's also the author of the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Jewish Culture on the Soviet Stage, Jewish Public Culture in the Late Russian Empire, and In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine. So Professors Hellbeck and Weidlinger, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex, for having me, and Jochen, really pleasure to talk with you and to do this event. Jochen, I followed your work for many years. I continue to regard Revolution on My Mind as one of the most important books to come out about the Soviet Union in the last 25 years or so. Particularly the way in which in that book you use those private diaries to demonstrate the ways that ordinary Soviet citizens internalize the Soviet mission and the Soviet way of viewing the world. And the city that Stalingrad, the city that defeated the Third Reich, I think is also a very important book, as is your website, which I have used. We've corresponded by email, but we haven't actually ever met before. So it's a real pleasure to meet you and to have this opportunity to talk about your book. So why don't we begin by just getting right into it and telling us what the major corrections that you see yourself making to the historical record are in this book.
Yes. Hi, Jeff, first of all, and thank you so much for being my interlocutor today. It's a great honor for me, as well as a pleasure. It's hard for me to say this in one sentence. So I believe that the central correction that I try to perform is to introduce anti-communism as a major driver in the war in the East and the Holocaust. Essentially, I'm raising this very big question once more. Essentially, how did this exceptional lethal violence come to form? How did the Nazis come to prepare for a genocidal war? And how did they convince millions of Germans that this was a necessary and indeed a righteous war? And my answer to that, which may come not that much as a surprise because I'm a Soviet historian and I come to the subject from Soviet history, is to sort of really see how central in Nazi messaging, but also in Nazi thinking and action, anti-communism figures. And here I want to say right away that this anti-communism is always, virtually always, understood as an anti-Semitic anti-communism. So the Nazis may say death to Marxism, but when they say that, they actually mean death to the Jews who invented Marxism and actually steering Marxism from the Soviet Union and through all the various national bastions, including the German Communist Party. So one just, I think, quite glaring example that I have in the book, just to give you an idea of uh, how entrenched this belief is among the Nazis themselves, and it's not just a message of a matter of outward propaganda. Is 1928 when the Nazis score their first electoral success in the German National Parliament and bring 12 deputies into the parliament, including Hermann Göring. And Goering's Swedish-born wife, Karin, he invites her to the opening of Parliament, and she describes her impressions to her mother in Sweden the following day. And the most striking impression for her are the 50 or so communist deputies in the Parliament. And she describes them as saying they have this very aggressive, brutish demeanor, and all of them are wearing the Star of David on their sleeves. That is the Red Soviet Star. It is one and the same thing. These are exactly her words. And so there is actually a Soviet star on their sleeves, but she imagines a Jewish star there. So this kind of intertwined anti-communist, anti-Semitic hatred is essentially the through line that goes through my book on the German side. And I think it draws new attention to 1933 as a watershed moment when the Nazis come to power, because they created concentration camps for the purpose of repressing the entire German communist movement, arresting upward of 100,000 communists. The 1930s see this outpouring of anti-Bolshevik, anti-Soviet, anti-communist, anti-Jewish propaganda embodied by so-called anti-Bolshevik shows that toured through all German cities and for some reason have not received the attention they deserve. We know of a few such exhibits, the Eternal Jew or the Degenerate Art exhibit. As I argue in my book, they're all part and parcel of a larger anti-Bolshevik agenda. And we see that 1939 to 1941, the years of the pact, are really just a brief tactical interlude for the Nazis, as for the Soviets as well. And 1941 is the true watershed moment when, with the attack on the Soviet Union, the Germans essentially launch the Holocaust. As I argue in my book, the determination to kill all Jews was centrally and initially a determination to kill all Soviet communists who are imagined as Jewish. And from there, in 1941, it spread in complicated ways to ultimately engulf all Jews of Europe.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the origins of this Judeo-Bolshevism theory and the association between Jews and communists. Now, I looked through Mein Kampf again, and in Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly portrays his turn towards anti-Semitism based on a realization that, in his words, I gradually became aware that the social democratic press was directed predominantly by Jews. When I recognized the Jews as the leaders of social democracy, the scales dropped from my eyes. A long soul struggle had reached its conclusion. Only a knowledge of the Jews provides the keys with which to comprehend the inner and real aims of social democracy. So he writes repeatedly in Mein Kampf portrays his turn to anti-Semitism in this way. Of course, we can wonder how legitimate that is, how he's projecting that onto, into his memoirs. But on the other hand, the 1920 Nazi Party program focused really on race and not on politics. A member of the race can only be one who is of German blood. No Jew can be a member of the race. And in fact, the party program includes nationalization of industry and other socialist measures. So at what point does the association between Jews and Bolsheviks become such a prominent part of Nazi ideology? And how does that process take place?
Mm-hmm. I argue it becomes a very prominent belief early on in the 1920s, and that is visible again in Mein Kampf among other sources. It's also in Mein Kampf alongside the quote that you provided, that Hitler says something along the lines, in Bolshevism, we have to regard Jewry's 20th century attempt to dominate the world. In other words, Jews are Germany's eternal enemy, a timeless enemy in this kind of timeless racial encounter and struggle. But Bolshevism, essentially, Soviet communism, the Marxist faith implemented by Lenin and his comrades, is the political instrument and the ideology that makes Soviet Jews particularly dangerous and particularly powerful. Hitler elsewhere also said, "I only recognize two ideologies in the entire world, and one of them is Nazism, and the other one is Bolshevism." So clearly, the Nazi self-definition, as I show from very early on, was one of counterposing themselves to Soviet communism, and it may not be fully apparent in 1920, but by the time period that I started with, 1928, it is, when you look at the Nazi propaganda from that time period on. There is a striking election campaign poster in January 1933 that I discuss and show in my book, that's preceding Hitler's appointment as chancellor. And it's basically, it has three words on it, this or that, and it counterposes two images of two men. One is meant to be this upright, bright, in light colors, Nordic man against a swastika, and then the sinister, darkly swarthy figure who then has a Soviet star behind him. And so really the alternative is Germany going to be racially pure and restored as a Germanic racial state, or will Bolshevism, will it succumb to Bolshevik chaos and destruction? And so I'm really seeing the Soviet communist faith and Soviet communist ideology as this as this defining foil for the German project.
The image that you just mentioned, the this or that poster, the image of the communist is also portrayed with very stereotypical Jewish features.
Exactly.
So maybe what role does anti-Semitism play in this process? And are you saying that the anti-Semitism is maybe more politically oriented than racially oriented, or is it something else?
I find it very hard to clearly delineate the distinction between racial and political, because it becomes so tightly fused into a single whole. What I would say is that Germans treated um, Jews in Germany after the incarceration of all the communists, which included many Jews who they saw as communists. But after that act, they essentially looked at Jews in Germany, in Austria, or in Poland as racial aliens. And so there was a racial calculus at play as pollutants to the Germanic, potential pollutants to the Germanic race, and subject to expulsion, often accompanied by exemplary terror. When it came to Soviet communists, especially Soviet communist Jews, I mean, communists who they identified as Jews, they would speak of a racial political enemy number one. And in fact, they called the Soviet Union world enemy number one. And so there is the added political vector. And in my reading, it is this added political vector that explains the absolutely massive, lethal hatred of the Germans toward that opponent, as opposed to the so-called racial aliens. And only in 1941, after the attack on the Soviet Union, did the Germans refashion the Jews in Germany and throughout Europe in the image of the Soviet communist opponent. And that had everything to do with, it had a lot to do with how, with the sundering of the pact in 1941, there is in fact violence breaking out. Communists do finally, they take out their muzzle, they're freed to act. They had been stifled by the pact. And so you see lots of uprising, sabotage actions. And in the German understanding, this is all steered by Moscow. This is essentially a Soviet Jewish orchestrated action, a concerted action, and that legitimizes them then to strike out against all Jews of Europe.
Mhm. Yeah, and that, when you mention the world enemy number one, which of course is the title of the book, that in and of itself, I mean, that's kind of controversial to say that the Soviet Union was world enemy number one, when we conventionally think of the Jews as having been world enemy number one. Of course, what you're saying is that they are conflated in the mindset of the Nazis. Is that right, or is there something else going on?
Well, this is not my invention, the
Yeah.
title World Enemy Number One. I'm just following what the Nazis are saying about the Soviet Union. So this is their choice. And I actually had an interesting exchange with Brendan Sims on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, who strenuously sought to argue that actually the United States is actually the actual world enemy number one for the Germans. But absent, this kind of a discursive evidence, I'm not convinced. I mean, the Nazis nowhere actually spoke of the U.S. as world enemy number one, and so I really follow. I take the language very seriously of my sources. However, in Congress it may appear, and however unsettling it also is, I really follow the logic of the language, and here I do discover quite a bit of consistency.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course, the two things can be true at the same time, right? The Soviet Union can be world enemy number one, but in their minds, it is the Jews who are controlling the Soviet Union, which then, connects with classic anti-Semitic tropes, being that there's a conspiracy going on, and the Jews are behind whatever evil you want to imagine.
Certainly, certainly. No, I will not discount that, but I would still argue that um, that as my book traces the prehistory and the the way Nazis imagined, then planned, and then implemented uh, genocidal war had everything to do with the Soviet Union and not with, say, the Jews in Poland or in Austria. And so I think this is incontestable if you actually look at how the Holocaust came to be, how it happened. There, I very much argue against, I think, multiple Holocaust scholars who would uh, really describe it as a step-by-step cumulative process in which 1941 is just merely one more step of escalating violence. And so the fact that there are now 3 million soldiers on the ground supposedly explains this, in my view, completely novel degree of violence that then extends to, not only the commissars, the political officers in the Red Army who are imagined all as Jewish, but to basically all Jewish men, and then followed by women, children, and the elderly. And in addition, millions of Soviet soldiers who are also depicted as Bolshevik villains.
Yeah. And certainly you see it in the Einsatzgruppen reports and in the various other reports, the Jager report, that the Germans are sending back home, in which they talk about killing communists and Jews almost interchangeably. They make a distinction. They say we killed X number, whatever it is, 50 communists and 100 Jews in this town. But they're lumping them together, although also making them distinct.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I never read over these distinctions. They are important, and they're also important insofar as in the sort of Nazi imaginary, and the imaginary also of many German soldiers who may not have been, card-carrying Nazis, but implemented these policies as they had been indoctrinated by, orders from like General Field Marshal Reichenau, that infamous Reichenau order, and there was also a Manstein order and a Höppner order and many others. Um, Essentially, a a a Jew in the Soviet Union was carried all the sufficient conditions for being a Bolshevik, whereas a communist who was not Jewish only had the necessary but not the sufficient conditions for being a Bolshevik. And so when they identified someone as Jewish, it was beyond question that this is someone who is essentially masterminding this communist project and needs to be killed on the spot. And that also explains why many Soviet communists who were not Jewish were incarcerated, but not necessarily killed.
Yes, I want to ask one more question on this topic and then kind of move on to something else, which is so if you see 41 as a major turning point, not just a spot in the timeline, how do the Nuremberg laws and German racial purity laws of the late 1930s fit into that timeline?
Well, as I see it, the Nuremberg racial laws, the Kristallnacht or Reichspogromnacht, as it is called in German today, and also, the anti-Jewish actions in Austria preceding it, the campaign in Poland, all of this served the larger aim of uh, segregating and expelling Jews from the larger Germanic Empire. And often a lot of violence was employed to shock Jews into action. There was no exterminatory goal that I can see in any of these measures preceding 1941. In fact, as late as 1940, and this is in the shadow of the German-Soviet pact, the Germans proposed to their supposed Soviet allies, well, why don't you actually accept all of the 2 million Jews under living, in our empire and settle them in Ukraine, on the Crimea, and in your autonomous region of Birobidzhan. And the Soviets kind of politely turned this down. They have reasons of their own. They feel that there could be many spies among them. And so the aim to really kill all Jews, it starts with the Commissar Order in March 1941, essentially identifying the political officer in the Red Army as this Jewish commissar who is responsible for all the resistance that is to come out from Soviet forces. They believe that really the commissar is pointing his gun at the nape of the neck of the soldiers and ready to kill from behind, a typically cowardly, Jewish thing. In reality, it wasn't 95% of all political commissars who were Jewish, as the Nazis said, but it was the actual percentage was closer to 10. But notwithstanding all that, all commissars were essentially immediately separated from the troops and shot, and sometimes in very ghastly fashion. I describe the nape and the neck shot in the nape of the neck apparatus that the Germans in Sachsenhausen implemented really to sort of deal with the commissars in ways that they imagined the commissars were killing their own suspects. So there's an amazing imaginary at work here that really shows you how central the Soviet Union figures in German thinking. But from the commissars, it then extends to Jewish men, women, and children as supposed partisans, civilians, and it extends to millions of soldiers who may not be Jewish, but are also seen as Bolshevik subhuman enemies. And so the actual ongoing resistance by the Red Army after the killing of all the commissars gives the Germans a new explanation that actually there is a broader Bolshevik infection of these troops, and so we need to kill them all. And so in late 1941, there is actually a caption that I found with a very striking image. I don't think it's in the book, that proudly proclaims 7 to 8 million Bolsheviks annihilated. And this is the yearbook of the Wehrmacht. And so there is something about killing Bolsheviks, killing Jew Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks, that is a matter of pride and necessity, which is different from how, even in 1943, Heinrich Himmler talks about the mass murder of the Jews of Europe, where he says this has to remain a secret. So the enemy in the East is a particularly bestial, always refracted as Asian or Asiatic enemy, where Germans have absolutely no compunction to engage in mass killing.
Yeah. And I've seen in my own work in the midst of civilized Europe, which was about the pogroms in Russia during the revolutionary era of 1918 to 1921, I think I make a similar argument that the motivation of a lot of the anti-Jewish violence was the accusation that Jews were allied with the Bolsheviks, more than what we would think of as conventional anti-Semitism. It certainly isn't racially motivated. It's also not based on religion so much. But what they say is that they are attacking Jews because the Jews are allied with the Red Army. And in fact, in that period, I'll add many Jews do become allied with the Red Army because the Red Army cracks down on pogrom perpetrators. And so when the Red Army comes into town and gathers all the Jews together, every other army had come into town, gathered Jews together and killed them. The Red Army comes into town, gathers the Jews together, and says, now come join us and help us defend the Jews in the next village. And then when they go to the next village, the villagers see that there are many Jews in the Red Army. And so they further, it snowballs. It further convinces them that the Red Army is a Jewish entity. So I think a lot of the processes that you're describing begin in the period that I look at, which is why I see that as in many ways the beginning of the Holocaust. It's the beginning of that ideology. Whereas what takes place in Germany in 1933, 1935 seems to me a separate trajectory. And it's the combination of those two trajectories in 1941 that becomes genocidal as opposed to repression and discrimination.
I agree. I mean, I would perhaps emphasize less the coming together in 1941 because I think even absent the measures against Jews in Germany, this violence could have become just as deadly in the Soviet Union. It might not have then had this reverse effect. That is clearly the case. But I think you're absolutely right, and I unfortunately couldn't shine the light on as fully as I wanted to on this primal, shadow zone of war and genocidal violence and in 1918, 1919, because my story still starts in Germany. And I only look at the Baltic areas where German Freikorps, basically soldiers were fighting a valiant battle against the Bolsheviks, actually with the blessing of the Allied powers who had, forced Germany to its knees, but were asking German soldiers to actually do this necessary fight against the new defining enemy. And so in 1941, you actually see how the Nazi discourse of anti-Jewish Bolshevism meets this local discourse and these local actions, the local memories that you trace so well in your book, and it is that meeting that proves extremely explosive.
Yeah, good point. Can you talk a little bit about the historiography and why what you're saying is so new, why people haven't talked about it all that much previously, how it's been repressed in Western historiography, and at the same time, really, it's been the way the Soviets have looked at it since the 1960s or so. This is the way that the Great Patriotic War has been portrayed in the Soviet Union. So can you talk a little bit about how it fits into the historiography?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, I think in part, uh, one reason why historians have been not really recognizing the anti-Bolshevism as a defining aspect of German propaganda is that um, so much attention was focused on specifically anti-Jewish propaganda. And so when you see a propaganda poster or some kind of leaflet, everywhere where it talks about Jews, this is collected and put into a volume and then it presented as Nazi propaganda or Nazi ideology of the hour. And for instance, when the Nazis spoke about the Commissar, even in Hitler's Commissar order, and the order that he discussed orally and then as it was implemented, there is absolutely not a single reference to the Commissar being Jewish. But it was so widely understood that the Commissar is Jewish that this Commissar order absolutely belongs into the context of the anti-Jewish incitement and ideology of the Nazis. And I think there we have come to sort of accept a reduced, truncated history, and it is largely bereft of these Soviet attributes. I think one other reason is I think that the Soviet Union still invites so many associations as an aggressor that it is kind of difficult for many scholars to sort of think of it as a target of Nazi aggression. So the overriding urge is to sort of see Hitler and Stalin as the two twin dictators who carved out Europe, who are responsible for the war. And then how do you explain all the Nazi violence against the Soviets? And so my way of doing that is to actually shift the attention away from Stalin, the leader, toward mid-level Soviet intellectuals, artists, writers, war reporters, chiefly Ilya Ehrenburg, who is my sort of chief protagonist on the Soviet side, a preeminent Jewish, Soviet, Russian writer, critic, and war reporter, and to really follow their perspectives and take them seriously, which is also something that many of my colleagues as Soviet historians I find don't fully do because they approach this public Soviet record with a great amount of distrust, thinking that the documentation in it is subject to manipulation or is outrightly invented. But when it came to Ehrenburg, I was able to actually verify that many of the documents that he cites, he was actually a documentarist in addition to a propagandist. He really collected all the documents he could get his hands on from the wartime. He's also known as many in the audience, of course, know as one of the editors of the Jewish Black Book. But beyond that, he really tried to collect in order to form a total indictment of the Germans. And these documents, I could verify that are actually authentic. And so that I think gives the Soviet war effort a kind of a new purchase, because as I'm arguing in my book, through the efforts chiefly of Ehrenburg, but also many others, and I would include the political departments of the Red Army, basically the political organization inside the Red Army. The Red Army was a political army. It was a communist army. They did so much enlightening work, political enlightening work, to inform soldiers about German atrocities, that in toto, I would say the Soviet population was the best informed population in the world about the German war of annihilation in the East. Now, how exactly Jews figured in this war is a very intricate matter. There is a quite irregular, inconsistent way in which the press at times highlighted Jewish suffering, at other times played it down. But throughout the years of the war, it was present, it was there, but often carefully framed so as not to overshadow the victimization of other Soviet peoples. But still, I think the argument stands that we're dealing with an extremely well-informed Soviet population. And in the final chapters of my book, I actually talk about how this information and this consciousness, the anger, the wrath, the outrage, also has real effects in, the Soviet violence committed against German civilians, also against, the German material landscape.
Yeah, and certainly the sources that you use for this book are incredible. And the Mintz collection, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Mintz collection of testimonies that you draw upon.
Yes, I was very fortunate to explore many years ago the holdings of the former Commission on the History of the Great Patriotic Wars. It was officially named, and it was an idea by the Moscow-based Soviet Jewish historian Isaac Israelevich Mintz, who early on in right after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, resolved to actually start this huge oral history project. It was patterned on an oral history he had practiced already as a documentarist of the Soviet Civil War. And so the method was there, and he just redirected, and the staff was there, and he redirected his staff to now essentially create, to collect as many documents, human documents as possible from the war. And in the later stages of the war, one chief focus of this commission was essentially the experience of Nazi rule, the Soviet experience of Nazi rule. So they followed the Red Army as it liberated, reconquered, formerly Axis held territory, and right there and then interviewed people. And you have these amazing long transcripts that read like audio tapes that had been stenographed. And I actually have a website where this is now visible. It's called SovietSurvivors.com. It's still under construction, but anyone who wants to visit is free to do so. Most of it is in Russian. Some documents have been translated into English and Germans. There will also be a Ukrainian channel to navigate through this website once it's complete, and there will be search terms. And so there's a total of close to 900 transcripts with survivors of Nazi occupation that I have tapped into for the purposes of the book. And these are really very moving documents, and they tell you so much. I mean, they're actually surprisingly candid, and they reveal that many of the civilians who interviewed, say in Kharkiv or in Kiev, they had they had not evacuated as they should have, or as they thought they should have, and then they provide reasons why they didn't, but then they refer to others and say that others didn't want to, and so you can safely deduce from that that there was a widespread sentiment that why give up my house now, and let's wait and see what the Germans bring. And that is actually articulated also in some diaries that I collected from this collection. And then the change of orientation comes as soon as the Germans arrive and essentially begin to humiliate the population racially, how they begin to flog people, how they kill in public, how they then leave bodies hanging on the gallows for weeks on end, how they flog people. All of these actions are so debasing that very quickly people realize that the Germans are not the same Germans from World War One, but this is a new, um, um, racist, imperialist mindset. And a new, actually, Soviet identity springs up from the ground because people realize that they actually were citizens, and that what the Germans bring is reminiscent or even worse than serfdom. And this redirection of the political horizon in some cases predates even the changing of the military fortune. So in summer 42, you see that already. And there's this one joke that I cite that kind of nails it, which goes like, what did Hitler do in 1 year that Stalin was unable to do in 24 years? That we began to like Soviet power.
Mhm. Yeah. Let me, so I haven't seen the Mintz collection, but it sounds absolutely fantastic. And I haven't seen your website, but I'll go to that website as well, probably as soon as I get off this call and start looking through the materials. But I have looked at a lot of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee materials, and a lot of the Yiddish press and the Soviet Extraordinary Commissions, which were the commissions that came into the liberated areas immediately afterwards and took testimonies, as well as trial records. And it strikes me that in many of those, really the racial component is emphasized, that the massacre, the singling out of Jews is emphasized in ways that are surprising given what we know about the monuments that were put up, saying, however many peaceful Soviet citizens were killed, and not mentioning that they're Jews. But in the Extraordinary Commission documents, the witnesses they interview talk about the Jews being killed. Even non-Jews who are giving testimony say they came into town, they rounded up the Jews, and they killed them. There's not much reference in those to them being killed because of ideology, because they're communists or because they're Bolsheviks. It's because they're Jews. And in fact, in the Nuremberg trials, the Soviets, and you mentioned that Roman Rudyanko mentions particularly and emphasizes particularly the role of Nazis' theory of racial supremacy as the driver of Germany's war of annihilation. And it's only after that that the Soviet memory of the war erases the particular fate of Jews and starts to conflate Jews with communists and starts to say that the war was ideological. It was a battle of fascists versus communists rather than a racial battle or an attack on the Jews. Maybe if you can describe how that process happens or why that happens, or if you even agree with my characterization of the process.
I do agree with it, and um, I'm seeing the same thing in the Mintz Commission documents, where exactly what you described vis-a-vis the extraordinary State Commission documents. People talk about the rounding up of Jews as Jews, and they don't necessarily put this in the context of a campaign against Judeo-Bolshevism, although many actually do mention that very clearly by basically saying the German soldiers came into the houses and they were asking Jude, Bolshevist. So these terms come up repeatedly. So I think eyewitnesses were, to the extent they were present at the scene and heard the Germans speak and could understand what the Germans were saying, they clearly, in a way, got the drift, while others may have just observed how, Jews from the communities were put in ghettos and then immediately killed in the outskirts of towns. Um, as far as the sort of conceptual reframing is concerned, I think Ilya Ehrenberg is a really very good example. He is actually quarreling with other members of the Black Book editorial commission about this very question, and Ehrenberg invariably insisted that um, the extraordinary suffering of Jews in the Soviet Union, which he fully saw and also talked about in some of his editorials, always had to be um, kind of um, suspended, as it were, or put into a framework of the larger Soviet reason of state. And so it always had to be framed within a kind of Soviet universal idea. And so Soviet Jews had to be represented as active joint fighters, as resistant fighters. And Ehrenberg insisted that actions by non-Jews from the Soviet Union, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Tatars, who came to the rescue of Jews, that all of that be emphasized, and of course that collaboration be muted. And whenever collaboration happened, it was really not made ethnically visible. It was just rendered somewhat invisible under this name Polizei, when it was clear this was a local auxiliary without an ethnic attribute. And so he knew that this was indispensable uh, for um, uh, for the kind of Jewish project inside the Soviet Union to survive, for his own survival. But it was also a matter of deep conviction on his part, as I would argue, because it was something he advocated for before actually the repressive mechanisms of the Soviet state actually came to be seen to members of the anti-fascist committee. So you could say he was prescient, but I think he was actually um, one of the few Soviet Jews who sought to um, reconcile Jewish particularity with Soviet universalism, and that is the reason why he survived, not because he was supposedly opportunistic. He was actually very, very courageous.
Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting observation, and certainly Ehrenburg is a really important figure in this, as well as Vasily Grossman, for that matter, who you also write about a little. There's a bunch of questions that we have in the Q&A, and maybe I'll encourage others to put questions in. Before we get to the questions, I just want to give you a couple minutes to say one other thing about another big correction that I think your book makes, and that's just the sheer sacrifice and role that the Soviet Union played in defeating Nazism. Maybe just give you just a couple minutes to talk about that because I do want to be sure we get to that, and then I'll go to the questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps it's not exactly new because others, when you read Richard Overy's Russia's War, he will talk about that sacrifice. I think it is when you put it in concert with the German actions that I think it comes to sort of speak in a new and very moving way because I'm trying to show how these German um, this very crass German behavior, the mass killings, but also the daily humiliations, how it directly sort of impinges on people in the ground and how it leads them to act in response. And so you really have a very kind of personalized, grassroots kind of level at which you can examine how the pulsation of this violence and how violence begets violence, but how Ehrenburg is one of them. He will basically say we're not repaying them with the same currency. We're not like the fascists, and how at times Ehrenburg himself becomes untruthful to his own dictum because he's so carried away with passion and anger. Um, all of that, I think, gives this perhaps a more embodied quality than many accounts that I've read, which really talk about this almost on the level of abstractions. That many the million people and those kind of sacrifices as a number rather than as a sort of collective story. But this is really important for my book because in the closing sections of the penultimate chapter, which takes us to the end of the Third Reich, I also try to bring the violence of the Red Army into conversation with the violence committed by Western allies on German soil against German civilians. And my argument is essentially um, I call attention to what I call a form of witness justice, which is essentially when uh, when you come face to face with this German violence, with the German genocidal violence, when you see the camps, it changes you as a soldier. Um, American soldiers were changed when they liberated the camp of Moosburg in Bavaria, which had, I think, 40,000 POWs in it, most of them Soviet POWs. And they started a rampage in that town that same day. They mass raped German women. They just went berserk. And I'm arguing that the Soviet Red Army actually had a much longer trail of violence, performed by the Germans to traverse on their way from their hometowns to Germany. They were in touch with their loved ones who reported to them in their letters about what had happened in their settlements, the destruction, the mass killings. They had an Ilya Ehrenburg who mobilized them in this very unique way that he had of bringing documents to the center of his reporting and distilling them, and then in his coda, essentially asking the soldiers, Soviet soldiers, to perform their duty as carriers of justice. If you factor all of this in, this very lopsided view that we have of, the barbaric Soviet violence in Germany as opposed to the chivalry of the Western allies, it actually looks different.
Mhm. Yeah, at what point do you think explaining that? I mean, you talk about in the penultimate chapter, you talk extensively about the atrocities that Soviet soldiers committed on German civilians as they were moving through, and explain it as you just did because of the horrors that they had witnessed over the last 3 years or so, or 4 years even. But at what point do you think explaining can cross over into justifying?
I'm not trying to justify at all. I mean, those instances when I describe this horrific violence that Soviet soldiers, many of them drunk, performed on in Eastern Prussia and Silesia, especially. I mean, they were reined in by official orders. Um, uh, Official orders had always been there to actually rein in the violence. It contravened official policy, but many officers looked the other way. Um, it cannot be justified in any way, and as cannot as the violence by the U.S. soldiers in Moosburg cannot be justified. It is simply a way of perhaps correcting the perception that there is something oriental and something exceptional about the Red Army violence in the East. That's the only reason I brought up this example and put them in the same frame.
Yeah, okay. Just want to give you the opportunity to say that. I have many, many other questions I would want to ask you, but we've only got a few more minutes, so I'm going to go to some of the questions that people have submitted. I'll ask a couple of them here that seem to me to be along the same lines. So one is from David Goldstein. What about the Nazi murder of 3 million Polish Jews who had nothing to do with Russian Bolshevism? Where do they fit into your thesis? And then a related question from Ed Horowitz. Were the anti-Semitic racist seeds planted and nurtured even earlier than the emergence of anti-Bolshevism in the 1920s? Is this hatred better understood if the origins emerge in folkish nationalism, thinking and actions?
Could
So, in
you?
other words, how do you connect it to the long stream of anti-Semitism that predates anti-Bolshevism?
Mhm, mhm,
Is
mhm.
how I read it. Um, And let me just ask another that's related, I think, from Stephen Sage. The 1939 to 1941 pact remains the great anomaly, not fitting the ideology of either the Nazis or the Kremlin. Can you discuss the loci initiative for this enigma on both sides?
Yes. Well, these are big questions, but
Yeah.
let me give it a try. So the 3 million Jews of Poland were killed starting in 1942 in the greatest number. There were, as I mentioned, exemplary killings. There was exemplary violence performed as soon as the Germans invaded Poland. Uh, but the goal it was to serve was expulsion. And so Heydrich asked his Einsatzgruppen in September and October 1939 to be very violent in Jewish communities. So as to incite them to pack up and leave east. The border in the east was still open as the Soviets were just beginning to come. And the idea was to really create a German province in the east that was racially pure for the Germans to settle. So the 3 million Jews of Poland were in their overwhelming majority killed after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and as I argued, because of the invasion of the Soviet Union, that they had become subject to this what I call the Bolshevization of the Jews of Europe. They had been revealed as allies of Stalin, and therefore they were that was the death sentence, and also a new method of killing Jews had been discovered in the East, and that too then traveled. But all of this followed what happened in the Soviet Union and because of the Soviet Union. So I absolutely see this as consistent. Um, and there's the Operation Reinhardt, which Himmler uh, promulgated orally in June 1942 which we can trace led to the killing of at least 2 million Jews by the following years, and most of them were actually killed in Treblinka. Anti-Semitism and anti-Bolshevism, again, I believe that anti-Bolshevism provides a political charge and a direction to an anti-Semitic sentiment that clearly invited violence, but the totality of, of the idea of total extermination, in my reading, had everything to do with the imagination of a political enemy who is organized on account of a political faith and a military arsenal, the Red Army. And that gives the anti-Semitism a distinct charge that it would not have absent the political ingredient. The pact, yes, it was an absolute anomaly in the sense that it ran counter to the deep channels and convictions that had formed on both sides, the German side and the Soviet side. And you can trace this in so many records from the time. You can see this in intelligence reports from Soviet security organs, that they report on the indignation, especially among young people who say, what is this kind of pact? Why are we suddenly pacting with the fascists? The fascists are our enemies. And so it seems very counterintuitive to so many people on the ground. The same is visible on the German side. Sergei Eisenstein is commissioned as part of this pact to perform to stage a Wagner opera, Valkyrie, at the Bolshoi Theater, and German officers are invited to the premiere in fall 1939, and they are shocked to see that, of course, the Jew Sergei Eisenstein has performed a Jewish thing with Wagner, and basically rendered Valkyrie as an ode to internationalism. And so there were just so many ways in which the official mantra, which the leaders on both sides understood, was absolutely tactical. And I talk about this in great detail about how the pact was convenient and served a specific tactical purpose for both dictators. It did not jive with the political sentiment, and so in 1941 things come back to where they had been before, and so that to me is really an interlude and not a major ideological reorientation.
Yeah. We have about 2 minutes left, so not really time to go to any more questions, but maybe just as a final word, if you can just talk about the Martin Niemöller poem, which you also wrote an op-ed in, was it the New York Times on?
Yes.
Which I think really exemplifies much of what your book is about and much of the points. So maybe in just 1 minute, if you can just tell us about that, and then I'll thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for raising that. I think the Niemöller confession is so important. Niemöller was this German pastor who had backed Hitler initially in 1933, and then he turned against Hitler and was arrested in 1937, comes out of the camp in 1945, and wants to atone for his early backing of Hitler with this confession in which he says, first they came for the communists and no one did anything, and then they came for the socialists, and then they came for the trade unionists, and then they came for the Jews, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to say anything. This confession is often rendered on U.S. ground with the first line, first they came for the socialists, just because to talk about first they come for the communists seems unseemly. And so this is the case actually in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, where you see the confession printed on the last room of the exhibit. And to me, this is just symptomatic of how the anti-communist vector in Nazi ideology, that for me is so central, has just been excised from the public record because it seems inconvenient.
All right. Well, I think that brings us about to the end of our time. So let me thank everybody for coming out. Thank you, Yivo, for hosting. And thank you, Jochen, for the opportunity to chat with you about this and for having written this book and for encouraging me, giving me the opportunity to read it.
Well,
So thank you all, and I highly recommend it. Go out and purchase it. World Enemy #1. Thank you all very much.
thank you, Jeffrey, for your incisive questions and observations. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.